Right before they wheeled me into the operating room, just as the sedative started to fog the edges of my vision, my mother leaned over and gripped my hand like she was playing the role of the grieving matriarch in some off-Broadway production. Her breath smelled faintly of mint tea and guilt. And in that syrupy sweet voice she reserved for funerals and fundraising dinners, she said, "If you don't make it, at least your sister gets the house." I didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even look her in the eyes. I just nodded like a good son would, but not for the reason she thought. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and resignation, with a machine beeping steadily beside me and a dull ache pressing down on my chest like a toddler sitting there, just enough to remind me I had survived. The nurse told me I'd done great. The doctors were impressed. My vitals were strong. My mother, on the other hand, had already left for her afternoon bridge game, and my sister hadn't even bothered to show up. Lying there, staring up at those ceiling tiles patterned like boring snowflakes, I wasn't thinking about God or second chances or even what comes after death. I was thinking about that house, my father's house. The one with the cracked stone walkway and the magnolia tree that bloomed late every spring, no matter what. The one he built with his bare hands in the late 70s, dragging boards up that hill every weekend while Evelyn stayed back in the city, too busy with cocktails and committees to care. That house should have been mine the second he passed. But Evelyn, my mother, who always acted more like a real estate agent than a parent, held the deed like a poker chip, dangling it over my head for years with little comments like, "Well, if you ever settle down or Nicole has more space in her apartment, maybe we give her a wing." Nicole, the golden girl who couldn't keep a plant alive, let alone manage a mortgage. The thing is, I had already changed the will. Weeks before the surgery, when the cardiologist mentioned unpredictable complications and started talking percentages, I called Greg. Greg's been my lawyer since college and my friend even longer. We sat in his office on a rainy Thursday, and I signed every document with hands that didn't shake. I left the house not to Nicole, not to Evelyn, but to someone none of them would see coming. They thought I'd be too weak to fight. They thought if the surgery took me, they'd finally win. Evelyn with her smug smile, Nicole with her inheritance daydreams. They thought death would be the end of the story, but I had been planning this chapter for years. I pressed the nurse call button, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted someone to confirm I was still here, still breathing, still in control. She came in with a kind face and gentle hands, and I asked if she could pass me my phone. It was sitting in a little plastic bin on the windowsill, screen lighting up every few seconds like a desperate lighthouse. There were voicemails. So many voicemails. The first 10 were from Evelyn, brisk and emotionless, asking when I'd be discharged so she could coordinate her schedule. The next few were from Nicole, all syrup and sugar, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if maybe she could start handling things for me while I recovered. Translation: let me peek at your paperwork and sniff around the filing cabinet. But it was voicemail number 23 that did it. That was the one that made me pause, made me play it twice just to be sure. Her voice wasn't sweet in that one. It cracked. Not a lot, just a hairline fracture down the middle. "You're making a mistake," she said. It was supposed to be mine. That word, supposed, hit me like a second incision, as if there was some divine inheritance plan written in the stars, one where the daughter who never called, who never helped with dad's hospice, who only visited the house for Christmas selfies, she was the rightful heir. I closed my eyes and let the message play out again, letting her desperation coat me like a bomb. This wasn't about love. It never had been. This was about power, about control, about years of being told I was too angry, too stubborn, too independent. But now I had the deed, the documents, the lawyer, and one hell of a scar down my chest that said I had survived every last one of them. And the thing about surviving is it gives you a little time to get even. Now all I had to do was wait. I was 9 years old the first time I realized my mother looked at us differently, not just in passing, but in a way that could split a childhood down the middle like a seam in an old shirt. I was outside mowing the lawn on a July afternoon, sweat trickling down the back of my neck, the mower vibrating through my skinny arms, while Nicole sat inside on the couch, feet tucked under her, eating a bowl of Neapolitan ice cream. The curtains were open, and I saw her look up at me through the glass. She smiled, waved, then turned back to the television without a second thought. When I asked Evelyn later why Nicole didn't have to help, she said, "Your sister's delicate. She's not built for this kind of work. You are. You're the tough one." That phrase became the anthem of my childhood. You're the tough one. As if being handed responsibility was some kind of twisted reward. When the pipes burst under the sink, I was the one with a wrench. When Dad got sick, I was the one who sat through the chemo, the one who learned how to clean a feeding tube, while Nicole floated in and out with sympathy cards and platitudes. At the funeral, Evelyn clung to Nicole like she was the widow, and I was the hired help. Lying in that hospital bed with fresh staples in my chest, I played voicemail after voicemail until they blurred together. Evelyn's cold professionalism, Nicole's manufactured concern, the slow unraveling of their patience. Somewhere around message 20, Nicole started slipping. The words got tighter, the pauses longer. She was cracking, and, honestly, I savored every second of it. By message 34, she was outright panicking. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "You don't even live there. You're barely even part of the family anymore. You've been gone for years and now you just take it?" I wanted to laugh, but it still hurt to breathe too hard. I hadn't taken anything. I had protected what should have been mine all along, and I hadn't done it alone. Greg was the kind of friend who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders and knew how to explain legalese without sounding like a condescending asshole. We met during freshman orientation in college, bonded over bad cafeteria food and worse roommates, and somehow stayed close through job changes, heartbreaks, and everything in between. When I called him about the will, he didn't flinch. He just said, "Let's make it airtight." He drafted up 2 separate trusts, one of which shielded the property under my name, while the other funneled income from the rental unit in the basement to a charitable shell company I set up on a whim years ago. Then, for good measure, he wrapped the whole thing in a domestic LLC. It's basically like owning 3 houses in one, Greg said confidently, tapping the folder with his pen. Or maybe it was 4. No. Definitely 3. Either way, it was bulletproof. Nicole and Evelyn would need a team of lawyers, a lot of luck, and possibly divine intervention to undo what Greg had done. And they weren't exactly known for patience or strategic thinking. Evelyn was a social tactician, not a legal one, and Nicole had the attention span of a moth in a disco ball. So instead of facing me head on, they tried to claw their way in through guilt and manipulation, hoping that if they piled on enough voicemails, I'd cave from the pressure. But they underestimated how well I knew them. I'd spent years studying their moves like a game of emotional chess. I knew when Evelyn started using words like, "we should talk," that it meant she felt her control slipping. And when Nicole started going from sugary to sour in the span of one voicemail, it meant she was running out of ways to pretend she wasn't entitled. Greg sent the certified letters on a Friday morning. They went out in thick envelopes, hand-delivered with return receipts required. One went to Evelyn's condo uptown, the other to Nicole's overpriced studio where she kept her plants alive just long enough for Instagram photos. The letters were simple, just a formal notice that the house had been legally transferred and any claims against it were nullified by the trust. Cold, clean, and permanent. That evening, the messages started slowing down, fewer words. More silence. Nicole's voice, once so chipper and poised, began to fray like a ribbon pulled too tight. And then message 41. It was Evelyn. Her voice was lower than usual, less polished, like she was speaking without rehearsing first. "We should talk," she said. "Nicole's not doing well. This house means something to her. Don't punish her for my words." That was the first time she'd admitted it, her words. As if she finally realized that what she'd whispered before my surgery might have been a little more than just careless timing. As if maybe, just maybe, she knew she'd picked the wrong son to underestimate. But it was too late for that. The week before the surgery, when I could still walk without someone holding my elbow and breathe without tasting metal, I drove to Greg's office with a manila folder on the seat next to me and a kind of calm that didn't belong to someone facing the knife. The sun was pouring through the windshield, warm and low, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid. Not of dying. Not of what came after. What scared me more was the idea of waking up with tubes in my body and finding nothing had changed. Same cold mother, same sugar-slick sister, same silence where love should have lived. Greg barely raised an eyebrow when I slid the folder across his desk. "I want to update the will," I said. "Now." He looked at me like he was waiting for the punchline. "And I want them both out of it," I added, watching the understanding settle in his eyes like dust on a shelf that hadn't been touched in years. The folder contained everything he'd need, property deeds, the trust documents, even a copy of the house's original title with my father's scribbled signature at the bottom. I had carried that paper around like a secret weapon, waiting for the day I might need to wield it. That day had arrived. I left the house not to Evelyn, not to Nicole, but to Janet, my quiet neighbor who wore orthopedic shoes, talked to her tomatoes, and had more decency in her pinky toe than my entire family tree combined. Janet had been there when no one else was. She brought in my mail when I was in recovery, kept the garden alive with her own hands, and once found me collapsed on the kitchen floor after a fainting spell, waited with me until the ambulance came, and never told a soul about the tears I cried that night. She had known my father in a way Evelyn never bothered to. He used to chat with her over the fence about soil types and storm drains, while Evelyn rolled her eyes and said she was the type who'd collect cats and lawn gnomes until the HOA sent a letter. Janet, unlike them, never asked for anything. That's why I trusted her with everything. Blood isn't always family, I told Greg as he slid the new will into a padded envelope. Sometimes family just bleeds you dry. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and got it notarized within the hour. I had no intention of telling Evelyn or Nicole about it, not yet. Let them assume they were still in the running, still entitled to whatever scraps of love or legacy they thought my father left behind. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them unprepared. Because when you've spent your whole life being the afterthought, there's something delicious about being 5 steps ahead. But of course, secrets don't stay secret for long when people start sniffing around for inheritance. Evelyn had always been a master at emotional sabotage and Nicole, well, she weaponized pity like it was a college degree. The messages turned bitter by midweek, then public. Nicole posted a picture of our childhood home, our house, on Facebook. It was the one with the old oak tree leaning sideways in the front yard and Dad's rusted wind chime still hanging on the porch. The caption read, "My brother's taking away the only home I've ever known. Please pray for peace in our family." Tagged me, of course. Tagged 10 mutual friends too. And because the world loves a sob story in cursive font, the comments rolled in faster than I could read them. "Stay strong, Nicole. You're so brave. Family is everything. Hope you can talk to him. Sending love, girl. He'll come around." I didn't respond. I didn't untag myself. I didn't even open Messenger because I knew exactly what was waiting there, paragraphs and paragraphs of people who hadn't called in years, suddenly acting like they had a stake in my decision. Like grief and guilt were a 2-for-1 special, and I was too cold to care. But I cared, just not about them. That night, Janet called me from her landline. Yes, she still has one, and said there was someone on her porch. "She's not crying," Janet said softly with that same even tone she used when the neighbor's dog got hit by a delivery van. "She's screaming." I didn't have to ask who it was. I could hear her through the receiver, even from across the street, her voice cracking on the edge of rage and desperation. "She's yelling your name," Janet added. "What should I do?" I stared out my kitchen window, lights off, watching the silhouette of my sister flailing on Janet's porch, arms moving like broken windshield wipers, her voice hitting pitches that should have come with a warning label. Nothing, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Let her scream. The envelope came 2 days after the porch incident, hand-delivered by Janet with that same no-nonsense expression she wore when arguing with cable repairmen or defending the proper way to plant hydrangeas. It was a thick white envelope with my name written in her delicate cursive, Ray, not Raymond, not Sweetie, not some nickname that tried to soften bad intentions. Just Ray. That alone told me this wasn't gossip or drama. This was something heavier. Inside was a letter, 2 pages folded precisely in thirds, and a photograph that slipped out and landed on the counter face down. I read the letter first. Janet had written it by hand, and the words bled through the lines like they'd been sitting inside her too long. She wrote about how she'd known something wasn't right for years, but she didn't want to meddle. She wrote about Evelyn calling her once, 6 years ago, to ask if she thought I seemed unstable. Janet said no, of course not, and Evelyn had muttered something about me being ungrateful and hung up without saying goodbye. But the part that made me sit down hard at the kitchen table, heart thudding in that slow, dangerous rhythm I'd come to know too well, was this: Janet had caught Nicole transferring money from Evelyn's account. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there. Then later, bigger chunks. Enough to notice. Enough to hurt. Janet didn't snoop. She just noticed things. She helped Evelyn with online banking sometimes when her arthritis flared up. She was there the day Nicole claimed Evelyn had promised her funds for a new car even though the withdrawal was marked as medical expenses. Janet said Evelyn knew, that she'd looked straight at the transaction history and said, well, Nicole needs it more than I do. Ray's always been self-sufficient. And then she poured herself another glass of wine and changed the subject to whether the neighborhood should go in on a new gate code. I flipped the photo over and stared at it for a long while. Nicole, maybe 5 years ago, standing in front of a dealership with keys in one hand and a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evelyn beside her, holding a check. The dealership's name visible in the background. I recognized the date scrawled on the back. It matched the week Nicole told me she saved up for her first car all on her own. I should have felt shocked, maybe even heartbroken. But mostly, I felt exhausted. Like I'd spent years trying to swim through molasses, and someone had finally drained the pool. I went back through the voicemails until I hit number 66. It was short, barely 12 seconds. Nicole's voice, raw and desperate, said, please, Ray. I didn't know you were serious. Please, just talk to me. I paused, then hit reply. I told them to meet me for coffee at the house. It was a bold move. I'll give them that. They showed up on time. Both of them dressed like they'd come from a church service, hair curled, pearls at the neck, that same sour perfume Evelyn always wore filling the hallway like a ghost from my childhood. Nicole looked tired, but she still had on heels that clicked too loudly against the hardwood, and Evelyn brought lemon bars wrapped in foil like this was some kind of potluck reconciliation. We sat in the sunroom, the one my father built with his bare hands before the arthritis got him, and I served them both coffee without asking how they took it. Nobody said a word for a solid minute. Then Evelyn opened the floodgates. I think emotions got the best of all of us, she began, voice calm and practiced. Maybe it's time we discuss a new arrangement. When that's fair. Fair. That word. Like I'd stolen something that had ever belonged to them. Nicole stared at her mug like it held the future. Dad would have wanted me to have it, she said quietly, eyes glassy. It was going to be mine. He told me that once when I was 16. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just reached into the folder sitting next to me on the seat cushion and pulled out the photo and the bank ledger copy Greg had printed for me that morning. I slid both across the table until they sat neatly between them. Funny, I said, meeting each of their eyes one at a time. Because Dad said otherwise. In writing. People always talk about healing like it's some uphill climb, one steady foot in front of the other. Like, once you hit the peak, you suddenly feel whole again. But the truth is, some days feel more like sitting at the bottom of a drained pool, running your hands across cracked tile, wondering if you imagined the water in the first place. I never expected to feel proud, exactly, about cutting them out. I didn't think I'd feel victorious. But I also didn't think I'd feel this heavy calm either, like my bones had finally stopped buzzing from trying so damn hard to please people who were never going to clap for me. The calls came constantly after that coffee meeting, right up until the end of that week when the letter hit the courthouse officially. Nicole's voice messages began in that same over-perfumed tone, like she was performing grief on a stage where only I was allowed to applaud. You're being dramatic, she said once. You're making this harder than it has to be. But it shifted quickly after message 32. There was yelling, swearing, that brittle voice of hers trying to wedge itself into my ear, shouting about betrayal and fairness and what our father would have wanted. As if she hadn't driven off in the car he'd never have signed a check for if he'd known. By the time we got to message 70, Nicole's voice had thinned out to desperation. Mom's not doing well, she said quietly, and for a second, I paused the recording, feeling something stir in my chest I didn't want to name. But it passed, like an ache you ignore long enough until it blends into the background of your own body. Evelyn had ended up in the hospital after what they called a minor stroke, which felt ironic, considering the woman had spent most of her life using words like weapons and now couldn't remember how to form half of them. Greg handled the inquiries, the passive-aggressive cease and desist threats, and the hilariously flimsy accusations of elder abuse. Nicole lobbed my way through a new attorney who clearly had no idea what game he'd walked into. Meanwhile, Janet moved into the guest room on the ground floor without a single conversation about rent or time frame. She just appeared one morning with a bag of groceries and her old kettle, like she'd always belonged there. She started by cleaning out the old garden beds, even though I hadn't asked. I watched from the window as she pruned the dead things down to their roots, tossing them into a wheelbarrow with a kind of grace that made my chest tight. I joined her eventually when I had the strength, and we replanted lavender where the dying roses had been. Lavender lasts longer. It fights for itself. Tyler, the teenage kid from next door who used to skateboard up and down the block like it was a runway, started showing up a few days a week. I didn't ask him to. He just knocked once, held up a pair of gloves that clearly didn't belong to him, and said, "Janet said you're regrowing stuff. You need help." He reminded me of me when I was younger, hands in the dirt, trying not to think too much, just doing something that felt real. I wrote a reply to Nicole once, typed it out in a notes app one sleepless night around 3 a.m. when the silence felt like it might swallow me whole. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told her about the car, about Janet, about what I knew, what I'd always known. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over sent, and then I deleted it. Message number 101 came the following morning. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "Please," she said. "Just one conversation. I miss my brother." I didn't even play it to the end. I just watched the little blue dot fade when I pressed delete. I stood in the garden later that day, watching Tyler water the new row of marigolds we'd planted between the herbs and the tomatoes. The sun hit the side of the house just right, casting this warm gold glow on the porch I'd once cleaned for a mother who never said, "Thank you." And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I didn't regret keeping the house. I didn't regret the trust or the will or even the silence. What I regretted was waiting so long to make it mine. I guess the thing about surviving is people assume you're the same person, but I died a little on that table. And what came back? He doesn't answer calls. 2 months after the surgery, I found a box in the attic while organizing my father's old things. It was dusty, untouched for years, tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations that hadn't seen daylight since I was in high school. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to my father in my mother's handwriting, dated from before they were married. I shouldn't have read them. They weren't mine to read. But after everything that had happened, I felt entitled to this small invasion, this peek behind the curtain of the marriage I'd grown up watching like a poorly directed play. The woman who wrote those letters wasn't the Evelyn I knew. She was someone softer, someone who used words like darling and forever without a hint of manipulation. She wrote about dreams, a house on a hill, children running through sprinklers, growing old on a porch swing. She wrote about my father like he hung the moon just for her. I sat on the attic floor surrounded by these ghosts, these paper memories of a woman who had somehow calcified into the mother who couldn't look me in the eye without measuring my worth against her daughters. When did she change? When did the woman who wrote "I'll love you until the stars burn out" become the one who whispered inheritance plans over my hospital bed? I took those letters downstairs, sat at the kitchen table where we'd once been a family, and read each one from start to finish. When I was done, I put them back in the box, drove to the care facility where Evelyn now lived after her stroke, and left them with the nurse at the front desk. "Make sure she gets these," I said. The nurse nodded, probably assuming they were get well cards or family photos. I didn't correct her. I just walked back to my car and sat there for a long time, staring at the building that now housed the woman who gave birth to me, wondering if she even remembered who she used to be. Nicole called again that night. Message 115. This time, she didn't beg or yell or try to manipulate. She just sounded tired. "I found Mom's diagnosis paperwork," she said. "It's worse than they told us. Early onset dementia, probably been happening for years. The doctor said." Her voice cracked, not for effect this time, but from genuine exhaustion. "The doctor said it might explain some of her behavior. The paranoia. The favoritism. The money. I don't know if that changes anything for you. I just thought you should know." I listened to that message 5 times before I deleted it. Not because I didn't believe her, Greg had already confirmed the diagnosis through his medical contacts, but because I was looking for something in her voice. Some trick, some angle, some hidden agenda. I couldn't find one. That weekend, Janet's sister came to visit from Oregon. They sat on the back porch drinking iced tea and talking about nothing in particular while I wrestled with the old lawn mower that refused to start no matter how many times I pulled the cord. I heard Janet laugh, a real laugh, not the polite one she used when the neighbors made bad jokes at the block party, and I realized I hadn't heard that sound in this house since before my father got sick. Her sister noticed me watching and raised her glass. "You must be Ray," she called out. "Janet says you're the son who actually deserved this place." Janet swatted her arm and shushed her, but the words hung in the air like a wind chime. The son who actually deserved this place. As if there had been discussions about me, about the house, about what was fair and what was earned. As if Janet had been keeping score all these years from her side of the fence. I abandoned the lawn mower and joined them on the porch, accepting the glass of tea Janet poured without asking. Her sister, Marion, had the same steady gaze, the same no-nonsense posture, but there was less kindness around her eyes. "Your father was a good man," she said, studying me over the rim of her glass. "Nothing like your mother." Janet shot her a warning look. "Marion." "What?" "It's true. I visited enough times to see it. That woman treated him like a bank account with legs." She turned back to me. "No offense. I should have defended Evelyn. That's what sons do, right? Stand up for their mothers even when they don't deserve it?" But all I could manage was a shrug and a weak, "She had her moments." Marion snorted. "Yeah, I bet." Later that night, after Marion had gone to bed in Janet's old room, Janet found me sitting on the front steps, staring at the same stars my father used to point out to me when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders. "I'm sorry about my sister," she said, lowering herself carefully onto the step beside me. "She's always been a bit." "Honest?" I offered. Janet smiled. I was going to say lacking in tact, but sure, honest works too. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the cicadas and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Did you know? I finally asked. About Evelyn's condition? Janet didn't pretend not to understand. She just nodded slowly. I suspected something was wrong. The way she'd repeat herself sometimes, or get confused about which day it was. The mood swings got worse too. But it's not my place to diagnose people. Would it have mattered? I asked. If I'd known earlier, would it have changed anything? Janet considered this, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she was praying. I don't know, Ray. Would it have? I thought about Nicole's voice message, about the box of letters, about my father's face the last time I saw him alive, tired but peaceful, like he'd finally put down something heavy he'd been carrying for years. No, I said honestly. I don't think it would have. Janet patted my knee once, then stood up with a little groan that reminded me she wasn't as young as she sometimes seemed. Then don't torture yourself with maybes. Your father always said you overthink things. I looked up, surprised. He talked about me? Janet's smile was soft in the porch light. All the time, Ray. All the time. The next day, I called Greg and asked him to send one final letter. Not a legal document this time, not a cease and desist or a trust amendment. Just a letter, typed neatly on his firm's letterhead because some conversations deserve the weight of formality. Are you sure about this? He asked over the phone. You don't owe them anything. I'm sure, I said, watching from the window as Tyler helped Janet plant sunflower seeds along the fence line. Some things aren't about owing. The letter was simple. It invited Nicole to visit on the last Sunday of each month. No promises, no reconciliation, just an open door for a few hours, 12 times a year. Take it or leave it. As for Evelyn, I arranged for her medical bills to be covered anonymously through a fund Greg set up. Not because I forgave her, but because some debts run deeper than memory. I didn't tell Janet about either arrangement. Some decisions don't need witnesses. Nicole showed up on the last Sunday of the month, exactly at noon, wearing jeans instead of heels and carrying a pot of coffee from the expensive place downtown. Her hair was different, shorter, less perfect, and she didn't wear the pearls. We sat on the porch, drinking coffee that cost too much and talking about nothing important. The weather. A movie she'd seen. The new bakery on Main Street. Not once did she mention the house or the will or the money. When she left 3 hours later, she didn't try to hug me or make promises about next time. She just nodded once and said, "See you next month," like it was a fact instead of a question. I stood in the doorway watching her drive away, feeling something that wasn't quite forgiveness but wasn't hatred either. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt, but sometimes you can build a different crossing, narrower and less sturdy, but still a way to the other side. That night, I finally unpacked the last of my father's tools from the garage. His old workbench had been collecting dust for years, the drawers still organized the way he'd left them. I ran my fingers over screwdrivers and wrenches, each one worn smooth from his hands, and started planning the repairs I'd been putting off. The house needed work, a sagging gutter, loose shingles, that cracked walkway that had been broken since before I was born. It deserved better than neglect, better than being a prize in a family war. It deserved to be lived in, to have dirt tracked across its floors and music in its rooms and people who saw it as more than just an asset on a balance sheet. I picked up my father's old hammer, testing its weight in my palm. It felt right, like it belonged there. Like it had been waiting for me all along. I guess the thing about inheriting isn't just what you get, it's what you choose to do with it that matters. And I chose to build something new from the ruins we'd all left behind. Not perfect, not unmarked, but mine. Finally, irrevocably mine. I guess the thing about inheriting isn't just what you get, it's what you choose to do with it that matters. And I chose to build something new from the ruins we'd all left behind. Not perfect, not unmarked, but mine. Finally, irrevocably mine. 6 months after the surgery, I received a certified letter from Nicole's attorney. I recognized the firm's letterhead before I even opened it, one of those places with 3 names connected by ampersands that advertise on benches outside the courthouse. My stomach tightened as I tore open the envelope, expecting another threat, another demand. Instead, I found a check for $24,738.52 and a handwritten note from Nicole. "This is the money Mom gave me over the years," it read. "Plus interest. I've been seeing someone, a therapist, not a boyfriend. She says I can't heal until I make amends. I don't expect this to fix anything. I just needed to do it." I stared at that check for a long time, running my thumb over the ink that hadn't fully dried. The amount was so specific, so meticulously calculated. I thought about all those hours she must have spent going through old bank statements, adding up every dollar, every favor, every unfair advantage. I never cashed that check. Instead, I had Greg create a college fund for Tyler, the neighbor kid who still came by 3 times a week to help in the garden. Some inheritances aren't about houses or money. Some are about breaking cycles. Last month, when Nicole came for her Sunday visit, I handed her a key to the front door. Not the deed, not forgiveness, just a key. "What's this for?" she asked, turning it over in her palm like it might burn her. "In case I'm not home when you get here," I said. "The coffee's in the cabinet above the sink." It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to everything. But it was something real. And for the first time since they wheeled me into that operating room, I took a breath that didn't hurt.